Mark's rhythmic snoring was the only sound in our darkened bedroom in Delaware. I was enjoying the rare, dreamless sleep of a soldier on leave. Then, the landline screamed like an air raid siren, tearing through the silence at 3 in the morning. The glowing screen displayed an area code that made no sense to my sleepy brain. Buffalo Police Department, New York. My heart skipped a beat and my stomach knotted tight. My muscles seized up, a cold sweat breaking out along my spine, a staff sergeant's reflex. Sleep vanished instantly, replaced by a primal dread. My hand trembled as I lifted the receiver, sensing a disaster incoming. Staff Sergeant Jessa Bryan. The officer's voice was dry, bureaucratic. We have a homeless woman in custody. She doesn't remember her name, but fingerprint analysis confirms a match with a missing persons file. Margaret Denton. I dropped the phone onto the duvet. My eyes fixed on the framed photo of my mother on the dresser. My mother, who had fallen into a ravine and had a funeral organized by my father 10 years ago. Why were the police calling me about a dead woman? What terrible lie was hiding in the dark? I didn't need 30 seconds to switch from sleep to combat mode. It was automatic, drilled into my marrow. I shook Mark's shoulder hard. Mom is alive, you drive, I'll navigate. Mark didn't ask a single unnecessary question. He saw the look in my eyes. The 1,000-yard stare of a soldier who just received intel that a teammate was still trapped behind enemy lines. While he threw on his jeans and went to start the Ford F-150, I grabbed my jacket and unlocked the safe. I slid my handgun into the waistband holster, checking the safety. Outside, the rain was coming down in sheets, hammering against the siding of our house. I took one last look at our warm, safe bedroom, then turned to face the pitch-black night waiting outside. For 10 years, I had lived inside a lie. Tonight, I was going to tear it open. We hit Interstate 95, the highway stretching out like a wet, black ribbon under the headlights. The tires hummed a monotonous rhythm against the asphalt. With trembling fingers, I dialed my father's number. The line rang, and rang, and rang. Finally, the connection clicked. Jessa? His voice was slurred, thick with sleep and irritation. Do you know what time it is? Are you having another one of your PTSD episodes? I swallowed the lump of bile rising in my throat, forcing my voice to remain steady, command-level calm. The Buffalo police just called. They found Mom. She's alive, Dad. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It stretched for so long I thought the call had dropped. I waited for a gasp, a sob, a question, anything human. Then he laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of amusement, cold enough to freeze the marrow in my bones. You are insane, Lewis Denton said, his voice dripping with contempt. Your mother is a dried-up corpse at the bottom of a ravine. She has been dead for 10 years. Do not bring your drama and your hallucinations to my doorstep. I am hanging up. The dial tone buzzed in my ear like a knife twisting in a wound. No hope, no shock, no questions about his wife. Just a ruthless, icy denial. He didn't care if it was true. To him, she was gone. And he wanted her to stay that way. We reached the Buffalo Police Precinct just as the sky was turning a bruised purple. The station smelled of stale coffee, wet wool, and cold cigarette smoke. The desk sergeant, a man with tired eyes, pointed toward the holding area with a bored expression. I stood behind the one-way glass, my breath fogging the surface. And then I saw her. It wasn't the beautiful, elegant Margaret Denton from my memories, the woman who hosted garden parties and smelled of lavender. The creature on the other side of the glass was a skeleton wrapped in skin. She was huddled in the corner of the metal bench, her hair matted into thick, gray clumps. She wore an oversized, filth-stained coat that looked like it had been pulled from a dumpster. She was muttering to herself, her eyes darting around the empty room at invisible demons. My heart shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. This was the woman who taught me how to tie my combat boots. This was the woman who sang me to sleep when I was afraid of the thunder. Now she was a discard pile. Society had thrown her away like trash. I pushed through the door. The smell hit me instantly. urine, unwashed skin, and decay. But I didn't flinch. I walked over and knelt on the dirty linoleum floor in front of her. "Mom," I whispered, my voice cracking. "It's Jessa. I'm here to take you home." She didn't look at me. Her eyes were milky and vacant, staring right through my chest as if I were a ghost. But when I reached out and took her hand, a hand that was rough, cracked, and blackened with grime, she didn't pull away. Mark helped me guide her out to the truck. His jaw was set tight, his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful pity as he looked at her. We left Buffalo as the dawn broke, painting the gray sky with streaks of blood orange. The drive back to Delaware took 4 hours. We stopped at a gas station, and Mark bought a cheap cheeseburger. I handed it to her in the back seat. Mom didn't eat it, she devoured it. She tore into the meat and bread with the desperation of a starving animal, crumbs falling all over the pristine leather seats of the truck. I watched her through the rearview mirror, tears streaming silently down my face. Then, I saw it. She stopped halfway through. Her eyes darted left and right, checking for threats. With trembling hands, she wrapped the remaining half of the greasy burger in its foil wrapper and shoved it deep into the pocket of her ragged coat. She patted the pocket, securing it, as if she was terrified someone would come and snatch the food from her mouth. My grip on the door handle tightened until my knuckles turned white. For 10 years, my mother had been fighting for scraps, living like a hunted animal, terrified of starvation. Meanwhile, Louis Denton, my father, had been living in a mansion, driving luxury cars, and sleeping on a mattress stuffed with insurance money. He knew. Deep down, I felt that he knew. The sadness in my chest began to harden. It burned away, replaced by a cold, white-hot fury. It was hotter than the engine of the Ford roaring down the highway. I wasn't just bringing my mother home. I was bringing a reckoning. I had just managed to get Mom cleaned up. She was sitting on the edge of the guest bed, wearing a pair of my old flannel pajamas. She looked small, fragile, but for the first time in hours, she wasn't trembling. The smell of the streets, that distinct mix of old rain and despair, was finally washed away, replaced by the scent of lavender soap. Then, the roar of an engine shattered the peace. I looked out the window. A sleek, silver Mercedes-Benz S-Class pulled into my driveway, looking completely out of place next to my muddy Ford truck. My father, Louis Denton, stepped out. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my entire military severance pay. But his face was twisted in a shade of red I usually associated with a stroke. Trailing behind him was Chris, my younger brother. Even from this distance, I could see the lazy, shuffling walk, the telltale sign of a man whose veins were filled with opioids. They didn't bring flowers. They didn't bring tears of relief. They brought a storm. The front door flew open. Louis didn't knock. He barged in as if he still owned me, owned this house, owned the air I breathed. He stopped in the entryway, wrinkling his nose theatrically as if he had just stepped into a sewage plant. "Where?" Louis barked, not even bothering to look me in the eye. "Where is the thing you dragged in from the gutter? I need to see just how far your insanity has gone." I stepped out of the bedroom, guiding Mom gently by the hand. She shuffled into the living room, clutching the hem of my shirt like a toddler. The moment Louis saw her, the air in the room turned poisonous. He stared at his wife, the woman he had sworn to love and cherish 30 years ago. There was no recognition in his eyes, no flicker of lost love. There was only raw, unfiltered disgust. It was the way a man looks at roadkill stuck to his tire. "Good God!" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Look at it. Just look at this creature. You call this your mother? This is a homeless mental case, Jessa. Are you trying to turn this house into a refugee camp?" He turned on me, stabbing a manicured finger in my face. "You have always been a disappointment to me, but this is a new low. You are trying to humiliate me by claiming this beggar is my wife?" Chris was leaning against the wall, smirking. His eyes were glassy, pupils pinned to dots. "Jessa, seriously," he slurred, his words sliding into each other. "You got that army PTSD bad, huh? You lonely or something? Just picked up a stray off the street to play house? Dad's right. Put her in a kennel." "She looks disgusting." Chris pushed off the wall and took a step toward Mom, raising his hands in a mock-scary gesture, like he was spooking a cat. Boo! Mom didn't just flinch, she screamed. It wasn't a scream of madness, it was a scream of pure primal terror. She scrambled backward, knocking over a lamp, and threw herself behind me. She buried her face in my back, her grip on my shirt tightening until I could feel her nails digging into my skin. She wasn't acting like a woman who didn't know these men. She was acting like a victim who recognized her tormentors. Something inside me snapped. The sadness evaporated, replaced by the cold, tactical rage I had honed in the desert. I walked over to the side table where I had placed my holster. I pulled out my Glock 19. I didn't aim it, I wasn't going to prison today. But I slammed it down onto the glass coffee table with enough force to make the entire room jump. Clack! The heavy sound of polymer and steel hitting glass silenced Chris's laugh instantly. Louis took a step back, his eyes widening. Shut up, I commanded. My voice wasn't loud, but it had the steel edge of a staff sergeant addressing a subordinate. This is my house, this is my mother, and you two are breaching my security perimeter. I stepped forward, closing the distance between me and my father until I could smell his expensive cologne masking the scent of his rot. You don't have to claim her, I said, staring dead into his eyes. But if you ever call her it, or creature, or trash again, I will forget that we share DNA. Do you understand me? Get out of my house. Now! Louis turned pale. For the first time, he saw that his daughter wasn't the little girl he could bully anymore. He straightened his jacket, trying to regain his composure, but his hands were shaking. You will regret this, he hissed, turning his back on us. You are dead to me. As the Mercedes roared away, leaving us in silence, I looked at my mother, still shivering in the corner. I remembered a verse she used to read to me from the Bible, 1 Timothy, chapter 5, verse 8. But if any provide not for his own, and specially for those of his own house, he has denied the faith, and is worse than an infidel. My father went to church every Sunday, but he was the infidel, and I was the only soldier left to guard the gate. If you felt that anger burn in your chest when he called her it, if you would stand between a monster and your mother just like Jessa did, hit that like button right now. Let me know in the comments below. Type, I stand with Jessa, if you are ready to see her fight back. The next morning, the enemy changed tactics. They didn't come with a battering ram. They came with a clipboard. Louis returned at 9 o'clock sharp. This time, he wasn't yelling. He was projecting the image of the concerned, benevolent patriarch. At his side was Dr. Evans, a man I recognized from the society pages of the local paper. He was obese, sweating in a linen suit, the kind of doctor who spent more time driving a golf cart at the country club than holding a stethoscope. I'm just worried about her, Jessa, Louis said, his voice dripping with a sickly sweetness that made my skin crawl. Dr. Evans here is a specialist. He just wants to take a look. I stood in the doorway, my hand hovering near my waistband, but I stepped aside. 5 minutes, I said. It was a farce. Evans didn't check my mother's vitals. He didn't ask her about the gap in her memory or the scars on her hands. He stood 3 feet away from her, wrinkled his nose at her worn-out clothes, and scribbled on his pad. He looked at her not as a patient, but as a liability to be liquidated. He walked back into the living room and signed a document with a flourish. It is clear, Evans announced, handing the paper to my father. Acute paranoid schizophrenia with aggressive tendencies. She is a danger to herself and others. I have authorized an involuntary commitment to the Green Hill Psychiatric Institute. Green Hill. My blood ran cold. That place wasn't a hospital. It was a storage facility for the unwanted elderly. It was a place where rich families dumped their inconvenient relatives to be sedated into oblivion. They didn't want to cure her. They wanted to drug her until she forgot who she was permanently. You see, Jessa, Chris chimed in from the porch. He was twirling his car keys, a smug grin plastered on his face. The expert has spoken. Keeping her here is practically kidnapping. You don't have the training. You are just a grunt with a gun. Louis stepped closer, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. Jessa, look at you. You are shaking. It is the PTSD, isn't it? The stress of the war. You are not thinking clearly. You are imagining enemies where there is only family trying to help. Sign the release. Let us take the burden. You need rest. For a second, the room spun. The gaslighting was subtle, precise, and devastating. Was I crazy? Was I projecting my own trauma onto them? Maybe I was the danger. Maybe I was hurting her by keeping her here. Their words were like invisible ropes, wrapping around my mind, squeezing out my confidence. Then, I looked at Mom. She was watching Louis with sheer terror. I snatched the paper from Louis's hand and ripped it in half. Then, I ripped it again. "Get out," I said. My voice was low, devoid of emotion. "If you or your hired quack step foot on my property again, I will call the state medical board and report Evans for malpractice. And Louis, if you try to take her, you will have to go through me." Louis's mask slipped, revealing the predator underneath. He didn't say a word. He just turned and left. As soon as the Mercedes disappeared, I went to work. This was no longer a domestic dispute, it was a siege. I turned my home into a forward operating base. Mark helped me install wireless security cameras at every entry point. I nailed the ground floor windows shut. I placed a loaded Glock, safety on, in a quick access safe in the living room, the kitchen, and the bedroom. That night, I sat in the dark living room, watching the camera feed on my tablet. Across the street, tucked into the shadows of a large oak tree, sat a black sedan. Its lights were off, but the exhaust pipe was puffing white smoke into the cold air. They were watching us, waiting for a mistake. At 2 a.m, the landline rang. I picked it up, saying nothing. The line crackled with heavy, wet breathing. "Let her go, if you want to live," a voice rasped. It was distorted, likely through a handkerchief. But I recognized the cadence. It was the choppy, slurring rhythm of my brother, Chris, when he was high on OxyContin. "Go to hell, Chris," I said and slammed the phone down. I walked into the guest room to check on Mom. She was tossing and turning, caught in a violent nightmare. Her hands were clawing at the air, fighting off an invisible attacker. "No," she moaned, her voice thick with panic. Don't push me." I froze. "Louis, please." She sobbed in her sleep, her body jerking as if she were falling. "Don't push me." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air raced down my spine. My mother didn't slip into that ravine 10 years ago. She didn't fall. She was pushed. And the man who pushed her was sitting in a mansion 5 miles away, waiting for the chance to finish the job. We weren't safe here. The house wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a trap. We had to move. I could not sit there and wait to die. The house, once my sanctuary, had transformed into a cage, and the predators were circling outside, waiting for the lights to go out. I made a command decision. I was going to move Mom to the Veteran Affairs Hospital across state lines. The VA system had its problems, but it was federal territory. My father's money could buy private doctors like Evans, and it could probably bribe local cops, but it held no sway over federal employees and military doctors. I had old squad mates working in administration there. They would protect us. I went outside to prep the extraction. The rain had returned, a cold, miserable drizzle that turned the driveway into a slick of mud and oil. I did a rapid walk around of the Ford F-150. I checked the tires, the mirrors, and the fuel cap. Everything looked normal. I didn't crawl underneath, the mud was deep, and the urgency in my gut was screaming at me to move. I went back inside and gently guided Mom toward the door. She was clutching a ragged, one-eyed cloth doll she must have found in a dumpster years ago. "We are going on a picnic, Mom," I lied, keeping my voice soft and cheerful. "Just a little road trip." She smiled, a vacuous, childlike expression that broke my heart, and hugged the doll tighter. "Picnic," she whispered. I buckled her into the passenger seat, double-checking the strap. As I climbed into the driver's side and turned the key, the V8 engine roared to life. It sounded strong. It sounded safe. I didn't know that death was already hitching a ride, tucked silently within the steel underbelly of my truck. We hit Route 1, heading south. The road here was treacherous. a winding two-lane blacktop that hugged the coastline with a jagged rock face on one side and a steep drop into the churning ocean on the other. As we crested a steep hill, gravity took over. The heavy truck began to pick up speed, 50 miles per hour, 55. The momentum built like a freight train. I saw a sharp hairpin turn coming up, a curve known locally as Dead Man's Elbow. I lifted my foot off the gas and pressed down on the brake pedal, expecting the firm, reassuring resistance of the hydraulics. My foot went all the way to the floor. There was no resistance, no friction, just a sickening, empty thud as the pedal hit the mat. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my brain instantly snapped into combat focus. The world slowed down. The panic was there, but I locked it in a box. Pump the brakes, I thought. I pumped the pedal furiously. Nothing. The truck was a 2-ton missile now, accelerating to 70 miles per hour. Jessa, too fast. Mom whimpered, clutching the dashboard. I reached for the emergency brake lever and yanked it up with both hands. It offered no resistance. It pulled up loose and limp. The cable snapped. We were doing 75 miles per hour, and the curve was 5 seconds away. I scanned the terrain. My options were a death sentence. To the left, oncoming traffic, a line of heavy 18-wheelers. Head-on collision meant instant death. Straight ahead, the guardrail and a 300-foot drop into the Atlantic. Survival probability? 0. To the right, the cliff face was jagged granite. Hitting it at this speed would crumple the truck like a soda can, crushing the passenger side, crushing Mom. Then, I saw it. About 50 yards before the turn, there was a dense thicket of overgrown briars and young saplings lining a shallow ditch. It wasn't soft, but it was the only thing that might absorb the kinetic energy without killing us. Mom, head down, I screamed, my voice tearing at my throat. Grab your knees. Brace, brace. She didn't ask why. Instinct took over, and she curled into a ball. I gripped the steering wheel until my leather gloves creaked. I waited until the last possible second, gritted my teeth, and yanked the wheel hard to the right. The truck left the pavement. For a split second, we were airborne. Then, chaos. Crash! The sound was deafening, metal screaming as it was torn apart, glass shattering into a million diamonds, branches whipping against the chassis like gunshots. The truck plowed through the brush, the saplings snapping and slowing us down, but the force was still violent. I was thrown forward against the seatbelt, the strap biting into my chest like a wire. Then, the world turned white. The airbag deployed with the force of a boxer's punch, slamming into my face. Darkness took me. I woke up coughing. The air inside the cabin was thick with the acrid chemical smell of gunpowder from the deployed airbags and the stench of leaking gasoline. My head throbbed with a blinding pain, and warm blood was trickling into my left eye. I blinked, trying to clear my vision. Mom, I rasped. I looked to the passenger seat. The side window was shattered. Mom was slumped forward, unconscious. Her head had struck the side pillar. Blood was soaking through the shoulder of her oversized coat, dark and terrifyingly fast. Mom! I screamed, fumbling with my buckle. I shoved my door open and scrambled out into the mud. The rain was pouring down now, mixing with the steam rising from the crushed hood. Sirens were wailing in the distance. Someone had called 911. I ran to the passenger side, ripping the door open. She was breathing, shallow, ragged breaths, but she was alive. I checked her pulse, my hands shaking uncontrollably. As I stepped back to give the paramedics room, who were just pulling up, I looked at the wreckage of my truck. The front axle was snapped. The wheel well was torn open, exposing the undercarriage. Something caught my eye. Dangling from the severed brake line, caught on a jagged piece of metal near the wheel hub, was a scrap of fabric. I leaned in closer, ignoring the dizziness. It was a piece of blue fleece. My breath hitched in my throat. I knew this fabric. I knew this color. It was cheap, synthetic fleece, the exact same material of the blue hoodie Chris had been wearing yesterday when he came to my house. The brake line hadn't burst from age. It had been cut, cleanly. And in his drug-addled haste, or perhaps his sheer incompetence, my brother had snagged his sleeve on the jagged metal of the undercarriage, ripping a piece off. I stared at the blue scrap fluttering in the rain. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mechanical failure. This was an assassination attempt. My own brother, my flesh and blood, had crawled under my truck in the middle of the night. He had taken a pair of bolt cutters and severed the lines, knowing full well that his mother and sister would be in that vehicle. He had traded our lives for an inheritance check and a bottle of pills. The paramedics were loading Mom onto a stretcher. I watched them, but I didn't see the ambulance. I saw red. I reached out and ripped the piece of blue fleece from the metal. I shoved it into my pocket, my fist closing around it like a vice. Louis and Chris thought they had solved their problem. They thought we were dead at the bottom of a cliff. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They didn't kill the soldier. They just gave her a target. I was sitting in a plastic chair next to the hospital bed, the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room humming above me. My head was wrapped in thick white gauze, throbbing in time with my heartbeat. Mark was standing beside me, his hand resting firmly on my shoulder, a silent anchor in the storm. On the bed, my mother, Maggie, began to stir. For the last 24 hours, the doctors had been worried about a brain bleed. But as her eyelids fluttered open, I saw something different. The fog that had clouded her gaze since I found her in the police station was gone. The vacant, animalistic stare of the homeless woman was replaced by a look of sharp, terrifying clarity. The crash hadn't killed her. Instead, the violent impact seemed to have shattered the mental dam that had been blocking her memories for a decade. She looked around the room, her eyes darting from the IV drip to Mark, and finally, they landed on me. Her lip trembled. "Jessa," she whispered. Her voice was weak, but it was hers. It was the voice that used to read me bedtime stories, not the mumbling of a stranger. "My daughter." I broke down. I leaned forward and buried my face in the sheets, sobbing. "I'm here, Mom. I've got you." But she didn't hug me back. She pushed me away gently, her grip surprisingly strong. She wasn't looking at me with love anymore. She was looking past me, staring at a ghost in the corner of the room. "He was there, Jessa," she rasped, her eyes widening with a horror that chilled the room. "He didn't slip. He didn't try to save me. He pushed me." I froze. The tears stopped instantly, replaced by a cold dread. "Who, Mom? Who pushed you?" "Louis," she said, spitting the name out like poison. She took a shaky breath and began to speak, transporting us back 10 years to Blackbird Gorge. "His construction company was drowning in debt," she said, tears sliding down her gaunt, hollow cheeks. "He owed $5 million to the banks. He told me we needed a getaway, a hike to reconnect. He took me to the edge of the gorge to take a picture. I could see it in my mind, the scenic overlook, the drop, the isolation. He stood behind me," she continued, her voice trembling. I felt his breath on my ear. He whispered, "I am sorry, Maggie, but I need the insurance money more than I need you." And then, he shoved me. My stomach turned. I gripped the bed rail until my knuckles turned white. "I didn't fall all the way," Mom said, her eyes squeezing shut as she relived the moment. "I caught a pine root jutting out from the cliff face. I was dangling there, 300 feet up. I looked up at him. I screamed, 'Louis, help me, save me.'" She opened her eyes and they were filled with an ancient, burning pain. "He looked down at me, Jessa. He didn't look panicked. He looked annoyed. He looked at me like I was a bug that refused to be crushed. He lifted his heavy hiking boot, and he brought it down on my fingers." I gasped. Mark let out a sharp breath behind me. "He stomped on my hand," she sobbed. "Once, twice." I felt the bones crush. I looked into his eyes, begging him, but there was nothing there, just ice. I couldn't hold on. I let go. The silence in the hospital room was heavy, suffocating. "I hit the tree canopy below," she whispered. "It broke my fall, but it broke my legs and my skull. A hunter found me days later, but my mind was gone. I was a blank slate. I have walked through hell for 10 years, Jessa. I have eaten out of garbage cans. I have slept under bridges in the freezing rain. I have been beaten, spat on, and chased away like a stray dog. She looked at her hands, the crooked scarred fingers that Lewis had crushed. But in my nightmares, I always saw his face. The face of the man who cashed a $2 million life insurance check on my grave. Rage. It wasn't a hot, fiery anger anymore. It was something else entirely. It was a cold, solid block of ice sitting in my chest. My father hadn't just abandoned her. He had murdered her, in every way that mattered, and used the blood money to build his empire. He used that money to buy his Mercedes, to buy his suits, and to feed Chris's addiction. He sat in the front pew of the church every Sunday, singing hymns, while the wife he mourned was fighting rats for a half-eaten sandwich in an alleyway. He was the wolf in sheep's clothing that the Bible warned about. I stood up slowly. I wiped the last tear from my cheek. It would be the last tear I ever shed for this family. I looked at Mark. He didn't need to ask. He saw the shift in my posture. He saw the daughter die and the staff sergeant take her place. He gave me a sharp nod. I walked out into the hospital hallway. I caught my reflection in the glass of the nurse's station. My hospital gown was torn, my hair was a mess, and blood was seeping through my bandage, but my eyes were clear. They were the eyes of a predator who had just picked up a scent. "Dad," I whispered to the reflection, my voice low and dangerous. "You taught me how to shoot. You taught me how to track a target. You taught me how to destroy an enemy." I touched the cold glass. Today, I'm going to use every single one of those lessons to hunt you down. I wasn't his daughter anymore. I was the karma he thought he had buried 10 years ago. And I was coming for him. The state trooper handed me the preliminary forensic report with a grim shake of his head. "It was not mechanical failure, Ms. Bryan," he said, tapping the paper. "The brake lines were severed, clean cut. Someone used bolt cutters." I nodded, my face a mask of stone. I showed him the scrap of blue fleece fabric I had pulled from the undercarriage, but I knew that in a court of law, a piece of cloth was circumstantial. To take down a man as powerful as Lewis Denton, I needed more than fabric. I needed a confession. I called Mike Harlan, an old friend who ran a private investigation firm in downtown Wilmington. 2 hours later, he sent a secure video file to my phone. It was footage from the security cameras in the VA hospital parking lot. The video was grainy and dark, but it showed enough. At 3 o'clock in the morning, a figure approached my truck. The person was wearing a hooded sweatshirt. They didn't walk. They shuffled. There was a distinct, jerky limp to their step, a twitch in the left shoulder. I froze the video. I would recognize that posture anywhere. It was the posture of a man whose bones were itching from withdrawal. It was Chris, my baby brother. I set the trap at a rundown diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place with sticky tabletops and coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. Chris arrived 10 minutes late. He looked like a walking corpse. His skin was gray and clammy, and there were dark, bruised circles under his eyes. He couldn't sit still. His leg was bouncing under the table, and his hands were trembling so violently that he couldn't even lift the glass of water the waitress set down. He was dope sick. He needed a fix, and he needed it bad. "What do you want, Jessa?" he mumbled, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding mine. "I got things to do." I didn't say a word. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I had stuffed it with blank printer paper, but to him, it looked like a death sentence. I slid it slowly across the table until it rested right in front of his shaking hands. "The police found the bolt cutters, Chris," I lied. My voice was calm, conversational. "They found them tossed in the bushes near the hospital entrance. They pulled a full set of prints off the handles. They are requesting a warrant for your arrest as we speak." The color drained from Chris's face so fast I thought he was going to pass out. He stopped breathing. You are lying," he stammered, sweat breaking out on his forehead. "That's impossible." "Is it?" I leaned in. "Forensics doesn't lie. They have you, Chris, unless you talk to me first." He started hyperventilating. "I wore gloves. I bought latex gloves at the hardware store. There can't be prints." Bingo. The air in the booth seemed to vanish. He realized what he had said a second too late. He slapped a hand over his mouth, his eyes wide with terror. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my phone, the voice recorder app still running. I set it on the table between us. Why, Chris? I asked. The anger was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching pit in my stomach. Why would you try to kill me? Why would you try to kill Mom? Chris slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. He began to sob, a pathetic mewling sound. I didn't want to, he wailed, sounding like a toddler. Dad made me do it. He said if Mom got her memory back, she would sue him. He said the insurance company would investigate the payout from 10 years ago. He would go to prison, Jessa. The banks would seize everything. He looked up at me, his face wet with tears and snot. He said if the money stopped, I wouldn't be able to get my prescription anymore. I can't be sick, Jessa. I can't handle the sickness. Dad said just cut the lines, just scare you off the road. I stared at him, feeling a wave of nausea. He didn't do it out of hate. He didn't do it for power. He did it for OxyContin. He traded the lives of his mother and sister for a plastic bottle of pills. He was willing to let us be crushed at the bottom of a ravine, just so he wouldn't have to face withdrawal symptoms for a weekend. This was the pride and joy Louis Denton had raised while I was getting shot at in Afghanistan. A coward, a junkie, a patricidal tool. You are pathetic, I said. My voice was ice cold. Please, Jessa, he begged, reaching for my hand. Don't give that tape to the cops. Dad will kill me. Help me. I pulled my hand away as if he were contagious. I have helped you your whole life, Chris. I defended you from bullies. I gave you money. I tried to get you into rehab. I stood up, looking down at the shivering wreck of a man in the booth. But you are not a victim. You are a predator who is just too weak to hunt on his own. You are not worthy of the name Denton, I continued. You are worse than Dad. At least Dad is evil because he has ambition. You? You are evil because you are a coward. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a $20 bill. I crumpled it up and threw it onto the table. It landed in the puddle of condensation from his water glass. Get yourself a coffee, I said. And prepare yourself, little brother. Hell is coming for both you and Dad. I walked out of the diner without looking back, leaving him sobbing over the money. I had the evidence. Now, I needed the main target. If you think Chris deserves to go to prison alongside his father for what he did, hit that like button. Do not let him get away with it. And I want to hear from you in the comments. If you were Jessa, would you have handed that tape over to the police, or would you have dealt with him yourself? Type justice if you support Jessa. I took a deep breath, visualizing the objective. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was a psychological ambush. I needed to lure the enemy out of his fortified position and into the open. I dialed my father's number. When the line connected, I pinched the bridge of my nose hard, forcing tears to well up in my eyes, pitching my voice into a register of broken, exhausted desperation. Dad? I sobbed into the receiver. It's Jessa. The accident. It was too much. What happened? Louis asked. There was no concern in his voice, only a sharp, predatory alertness. The doctors say she has massive internal bleeding, I lied, letting my voice crack. They don't think she is going to make it through the night. She's drifting in and out of consciousness, Dad. She keeps asking for you. She wants to see you one last time before she goes. There was a pause on the other end. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then Louis spoke, and I could hear the suppressed elation vibrating in his throat. Oh, good Lord, poor Maggie, I will come right away. Please, I added, delivering the bait. Bring your lawyer, Mr. Henderson. I can't do this anymore. I want to sign the power of attorney and the inheritance waiver. I just want you to handle everything. I'm done fighting. The hook was set. The line went taut. He thought I had finally broken. He thought he was coming to collect his prize. You are making the right choice, Jessa, he said, his voice silky smooth. I will be there in 30 minutes. We didn't wait at my house. That was too small, too tactical. We went to the mansion. It was the house Louis had built 10 years ago, a sprawling estate of brick and marble that sat on the edge of town like a monument to his ego. Every brick, every chandelier, every manicured hedge was paid for with the $2 million life insurance policy from my mother's death. It was a castle built on blood. I had arranged access through the sheriff, a sturdy man named Miller who had served in the Marines with Mark. He and his deputies were parked down the road, invisible in the tree line, waiting for my signal. Inside, Mark set up 3 micro cameras in the living room, hidden in a bookshelf, a flower vase, and the smoke detector. I sat Mom in the high-backed velvet armchair in the center of the room. I draped a heavy wool blanket over her, concealing her thin frame, making her look frail and fading. She grabbed my wrist, her fingers digging into my skin. "I am afraid, Jessa," she whispered, her eyes darting to the heavy oak doors. I kissed her forehead, smoothing back her gray hair. "Don't be. He thinks he's coming to finish you off. He doesn't know that today, we are the hunters, and he is the prey." At exactly 4 o'clock, the gravel of the driveway crunched under tires. Through the window, I saw the silver Mercedes pull up, followed by a black Lexus. Lewis stepped out, flanked by Chris and Mr. Henderson, his slimy corporate lawyer. Lewis was wearing a black suit. It was a premature morning outfit. He was dressing for the funeral before the body was even cold. They entered the house with the confidence of conquerors. Lewis strode into the living room, filling the space with his arrogance and the smell of expensive musk. He didn't even look at the woman in the chair. His eyes locked onto the mahogany table where I had laid out the legal documents. "Jessa, sweetheart," Lewis said, putting on a mask of solemn grief that made my stomach churn. "I am so glad you finally came to your senses. It is better this way. God is calling her home." Chris stood by the door, fidgeting, looking everywhere but at Mom. "Mr. Henderson has the papers ready," Lewis continued, gesturing to the lawyer. "Just sign here, transferring full medical and financial guardianship to me. I will handle the arrangements. I will make sure she has the finest funeral money can buy." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a gold-plated Mont Blanc pen. He uncapped it with a decisive click and held it out to me. That hand. That was the hand that had pushed her. That was the hand that had signed the insurance claims. Now it was waiting for me to sign away her life. I took the pen. It felt heavy and cold. I looked at it, turning it over in my fingers. "A funeral?" I asked, my voice dropping the act, becoming flat and hard. "Who are you planning to bury this time, Dad? Another empty coffin?" The smile froze on Lewis's face. The room went dead silent. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. I threw the $2,000 pen across the room. It hit the marble floor with a sharp clatter that echoed like a gunshot. "Mom," I said loud and clear. "Stand up." The blanket fell away. Maggie Denton didn't struggle to rise. She stood up with a strength that defied her frail body. She stood tall, her spine straight, her chin lifted. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a decade of concentrated rage. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Lewis's face. "I am not dead, Lewis," she said. Her voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a judgment. "And I remember everything." Lewis took a stumbling step back, his face draining of blood until he looked like a sheet of paper. He collided with the lawyer, nearly knocking him over. "I remember the hike," Mom continued, stepping toward him. "I remember the edge of Blackbird Gorge. I remember how you looked at me when I was hanging from that root. I remember your boot crushing my fingers." "No." Lewis gasped, his breath coming in short, panicked wheezes. He looked at her as if the gates of hell had opened up and spit out a vengeful spirit. You are crazy. She is crazy." He spun around to look at me, desperation wild in his eyes. "Jessa, she is hallucinating. You can't believe this." "I believe her," I said, crossing my arms. "And so does the camera in that bookshelf, and the one in the vase, and the audio recorder in my pocket." I smiled, but it was a smile devoid of any warmth. "You walked right into the kill zone, Dad, and there is no way out." The look of sheer terror on Lewis Denton's face lasted for exactly 3 heartbeats. Then, it shattered. As the reality of the trap closed in on him, the facade of the respectable businessman, the grieving husband, and the pious church deacon dissolved completely. What was left underneath was not a man. It was a cornered, rabid animal. His face turned a violent, mottled shade of purple. He let out a sound that I had never heard from a human being before. A guttural, wet roar of pure, impotent fury. "You bitch!" he screamed, spittle flying from his mouth as he glared at my mother. "Why didn't you just die? Why couldn't you just stay at the bottom of that damn cliff? You ruin everything." He didn't care about the cameras hidden in the bookshelves anymore. He didn't care about the lawyer cowering against the wall or Chris sobbing in the corner. His survival instinct had been overridden by a murderous need to destroy the evidence standing in front of him. His hand shot out to the heavy mahogany desk beside him. He grabbed a silver heavy-duty box cutter, the kind used for opening crates of expensive wine. With a menacing snick, he slid the razor-sharp blade out to its full length. "I will kill you," he bellowed, his eyes bulging. "I will make sure you stay dead this time." He lunged toward the armchair where Mom was standing. Mom screamed, a high-pitched sound of terror, and shrank back. Chris dropped to the floor, covering his ears with his hands and squeezing his eyes shut like a toddler hiding from a monster under the bed. He was useless. He was pathetic. But Louis had forgotten one crucial variable. He had forgotten who was standing between him and his victim. He saw a disobedient daughter. I saw a hostile target. "Fear is a biological reaction." The voice of my drill sergeant echoed in my mind, clear as a bell, drowning out the chaos. "Courage is a choice." The world seemed to slow down. My vision tunneled. I could see the sweat beading on Louis's forehead, the wild, erratic swing of the blade arcing toward my mother's chest. He was big, fueled by hysterical strength, but he was clumsy. He was a bully, not a warrior. I didn't retreat. I stepped into his guard. As his arm came down in a jagged slash, I executed a rising block. My left forearm slammed into his wrist, deflecting the blade away from Mom. The impact jarred my bones, but I didn't flinch. I grabbed his wrist, controlling the weapon hand. Before he could recover his balance, I drove a left uppercut deep into his solar plexus. Oof! The air left his lungs in a rush. He doubled over, gasping, his eyes crossing in pain. The knife wavered in his grip. I didn't stop. I grabbed his right wrist with both hands, twisting it violently outward while stepping behind him. Armbar. I applied maximum torque to the elbow joint and kicked the back of his knee. Louis went down like a sack of cement, slamming face first onto the hardwood floor with a bone-rattling thud. Crack. The sickening dry snap of his rotator cuff tearing popped through the room like a gunshot. Louis shrieked in agony, his fingers spasming open. The box cutter skittered across the floor, sliding harmlessly under the sofa. I dropped my full weight onto the back of his neck, driving my knee into his spine, pinning him to the ground. I grabbed his good arm and wrenched it behind his back. I leaned down, my lips inches from his ear, smelling the sour stench of his fear and expensive cologne. "Your power is gone, Louis," I whispered, my voice trembling not with fear, but with the adrenaline of the kill. "You are not a king. You are just a criminal lying at my feet." Crash! The front doors burst open, splintering off the frame. "Sheriff's Department, get on the ground, now." A team of deputies in tactical gear swarmed into the room, their rifles raised, flashlights cutting through the dim interior. "Drop the weapon. Show me your hands." I slowly released my grip on my father. I raised my hands, interlacing my fingers behind my head, but I kept my eyes locked on the man beneath me. "The scene is secure," I yelled, my voice steady. "Suspect is subdued." Two deputies rushed forward, hauling Louis up from the floor. He was limp, sobbing uncontrollably, cradling his broken arm against his chest. As they slapped the handcuffs on him, reading him his Miranda rights, he looked incredibly small. The giant who had cast a terrifying shadow over our lives for a decade was just a broken, pathetic old man in a torn suit. Another deputy grabbed Chris. He didn't fight. He just went boneless, weeping openly as the plastic zip ties cinched tight around his wrists. "Jessa!" Chris wailed as they dragged him toward the door, his feet dragging on the marble. "Jessa, please. Tell them I didn't do anything. Save me. I am your brother." I watched him, feeling absolutely nothing. The pity I had once held for him had evaporated in that diner. "I have saved you 1,000 times, Chris," I said, my voice cutting through his sobs like a knife. This time, save yourself. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, was already talking to a detective in the corner, his hands shaking as he spilled everything he knew in a desperate attempt to cut a plea deal. The room cleared out quickly. The flashing red and blue lights from the cruisers outside pulsed through the windows, painting the walls in a chaotic, rhythmic dance. Then silence returned to the mansion. I turned to the armchair. Mom was standing there, shaking. She looked at the empty doorway where her tormentor had just been dragged out, and then she looked at me. She took a hesitant step forward and opened her arms. I walked into them, and she held me. It wasn't the weak, tentative hug of the homeless woman in the police station. It was a mother's hug. Firm, protective, real. "Thank you, Jessa," she sobbed into my shoulder, her tears soaking my shirt. "You saved me. You really saved me." I buried my face in her neck, smelling the faint scent of the lavender soap we had used that morning. The adrenaline crashed, and my knees went weak. I slid down to the floor, pulling her with me. We sat there on the expensive, cold marble of the house built on lies, holding each other. I let the tears come. I wasn't crying for the loss of my father or my brother. I was crying for the victory. The monster under the bed was gone. We had won. The Denton case didn't just make the local news, it exploded across the entire country. For 3 weeks, the steps of the new Castle County Courthouse were turned into a media circus. Satellite trucks from CNN and Fox News lined the streets, their dishes pointed at the sky like hungry mouths. The headlines were sensational and ruthless. The devil in a designer suit and the wife who came back from the dead. The same neighbors who used to attend my father's summer barbecues, the same business partners who used to laugh at his jokes and drink his scotch, now lined up to spit on his reputation. They gave interviews calling him the shame of Delaware. It was a feeding frenzy, and Lewis Denton was the main course. I didn't hide from the cameras. On the first day of the trial, I put on my army dress blues. I polished my brass buttons until they shone like gold and pinned my ribbons to my chest. I held my mother's arm, guiding her through the sea of flashing bulbs. I didn't need their praise, and I didn't want their pity. I just wanted the world to see the difference between a soldier and a criminal. I wanted them to know that while my father was a monster, the Denton name, at least my side of it, still stood for honor. Inside the courtroom, Lewis tried to play the part of the victim one last time. He sat at the defense table, wearing a new suit that his high-priced legal team had bought for him, looking indignant. His defense was laughable. He claimed my mother was insane, that she had thrown herself off that cliff 10 years ago, and that I was a bitter, unstable daughter suffering from war trauma who had orchestrated a frame-up. He almost looked convincing. He was a master manipulator after all. But then the district attorney played the tapes. First came the audio from the diner. Chris's voice, whining and pathetic, confessing to the cut-break lines filled the silent courtroom. Then came the video from the hidden cameras in the mansion. The jury watched in stunned silence as Lewis Denton, the pillar of the community, lunged at his frail wife with a box cutter, screaming that he wanted her dead. The gasps from the gallery were audible. The jury members looked at Lewis not with doubt, but with revulsion. Then came the final nail in the coffin. Chris took the stand. My brother, desperate to avoid a life sentence, had taken a plea deal. He sang like a canary. He sat in the witness box, refusing to look at his father, and spilled every dirty secret Lewis had ever kept. He detailed the insurance fraud, the money laundering through the construction company to hide the debts, and the years of domestic abuse that preceded the attempted murder. I watched Lewis's face as Chris spoke. He turned a shade of gray I had never seen before. He realized finally that his money was useless. His son had sold him out, just as he had sold out his family. The sentencing hearing took place on a rainy Tuesday morning. The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for theatrics, looked down at my father over her glasses. She didn't lecture him, she just read the facts. "Defendant Lewis Denton," she said, her voice echoing off the wood paneling. "On the count of attempted murder in the first degree, financial fraud, and aggravated assault, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Lewis slumped in his chair. It was over. He would die in a concrete box. Defendant Christopher Denton. The judge continued. For conspiracy to commit murder and reckless endangerment, you are sentenced to 15 years in a state correctional facility. As the bailiffs hauled Lewis up to take him away, he stopped. He turned his head and locked eyes with me. There was no remorse in his gaze, only a deep, burning hatred. He mouthed something, a curse, but no sound came out. I didn't look away. I didn't flinch. I looked him dead in the eye, straightened my spine, and mouthed back 2 words. Goodbye, Dad. It wasn't a wish for his well-being. It was a dismissal. I was exorcising him from my soul. The court battle ended with a final judgment on the assets. Since the wealth Lewis had accumulated was largely based on the fraudulent life insurance payout from my mother's death, the court seized everything. After the banks were paid off and the debts settled, there was about $1.5 million left. The judge awarded every cent of it to Margaret Denton as restitution for pain and suffering. We sat in the lawyer's office afterward. Mr. Henderson's replacement, a court-appointed trustee, slid a check across the desk toward Mom. It is a lot of money, Mrs. Denton, he said. It is enough to buy a nice house, retire comfortably. You deserve this. Mom looked at the check. Her hands, still scarred from where Lewis's boots had crushed them, hovered over the paper. She looked at the zeros. No, she said softly. The lawyer blinked. Excuse me? I don't want it, Mom said, her voice gaining strength. I don't want a single penny of his money. It smells like blood. It smells like the ravine. She pushed the check back. Jessa, tell him. I smiled, taking my mother's hand. We have a plan, I told the lawyer. We liquidated everything. The mansion, the cars, the accounts. We took every single dollar of that $1.5 million and we donated it. We filed the paperwork that afternoon to establish the Maggie Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing legal aid and safe housing for women and children escaping domestic violence. We walked out of that courthouse with absolutely nothing. We had no house, no fortune, and no legacy in the eyes of the bank. But as we stepped out into the rain, breathing the fresh, clean air of freedom, I felt richer than Lewis Denton had ever been in his miserable life. We didn't need his blood money. We had each other, and we had our honor. And that was something he could never buy. 6 months have passed since the heavy oak doors of the state penitentiary slammed shut behind my father. We traded the sprawling, blood-soaked mansion for a weathered cedar shingle cottage in Rehoboth Beach. It is small, the kind of place where the floorboards creak when you walk and the windows rattle slightly when the wind blows off the Atlantic. There is no marble foyer here, no crystal chandeliers, and certainly no gold-plated pens. But when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I hear is the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the shore, not the silence of a house built on secrets. I sat on the back porch, watching my mother in the garden. She has changed so much. The gaunt, terrified ghost who hid behind me is gone. In her place is a woman with sun-kissed skin and a few healthy pounds on her frame. She was kneeling in the dirt, humming a country song, planting a new row of flowers. They were yellow daisies. I smiled, taking a sip of my iced tea. Lewis had banned daisies from the mansion. He called them weeds and trash flowers, fit only for poor people. He only wanted imported roses that cost a fortune and had to be tended by professionals. But here, Mom was planting hundreds of them. They were bright, resilient, and wild, just like her. She looked up, saw me watching, and waved with a dirt-stained hand, her laugh carrying on the salt breeze as she chatted with our neighbor over the low fence. She was finally free. I looked down at the paperwork on my lap. It was my official separation letter from the United States Army. An honorable discharge. Yesterday, I packed away my dress blues. I folded the uniform with precision, smoothing out the creases, and placed it inside a shadow box along with my medals and my service pistol. I hung it in the hallway, not as a shrine to who I am, but as a memorial to who I used to be. I don't need to go to a foreign desert to fight for a cause anymore. I don't need the adrenaline of combat to numb the pain of my childhood. The biggest war of my life, the war for my family's survival, has been won. I picked up a textbook from the table, Advanced Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Trauma Survivors. I have enrolled in a graduate program for psychology. I am going to use my GI Bill benefits to become a counselor. I want to work with veterans coming home with PTSD and with women like my mother who have been broken by domestic violence. I want to be the person who hands them a flashlight when they are stuck in the dark. I want to show them that broken things can be put back together stronger than before. Hey, soldier, Mark called out from the grill. Burgers are almost done. The smell of charcoal and grilled meat filled the air, the quintessential scent of an American summer. We were throwing a small backyard barbecue for Mom's 60th birthday. It was just us, but it felt like a grand celebration. I walked over to Mark. He was flipping burgers, wearing a silly apron that said, Grill Sergeant. He looked happy. Uncomplicated, beautiful happiness. I have a present for Mom, I said, but I think you should open this one first. I handed him a small white rectangular box wrapped in a blue ribbon. Mark wiped his hands on a towel and took it, looking confused. For me? It isn't my birthday. He pulled the ribbon and opened the lid. Inside lay a plastic stick with 2 distinct pink lines. He froze. The spatula fell from his hand, landing in the grass. He looked at the test, then at my stomach, then up at my eyes. Jessa? He choked out. Are you? We are going to have a baby, Mark, I whispered, tears pricking my eyes. We are going to have a family. He didn't say a word. He just scooped me up in his arms and spun me around, burying his face in my neck. Mom, seeing the commotion, ran over. When we told her, she fell to her knees in the grass, weeping with joy, kissing my hands. This child would never know the inside of a courtroom. This child would never know the sound of a lock clicking shut or the fear of heavy footsteps in the hallway. This child would grow up knowing only unconditional love and safety. This baby was the living proof that the cycle of abuse had been broken. Evil had tried to destroy us, but it had only cleared the ground for new life to grow. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the ocean in shades of fire and violet, I sat alone on the porch steps. I thought about Lewis Denton. Right now, he was likely sitting in a 6x8 cell, surrounded by concrete and steel. He still had millions of dollars in offshore accounts that the courts couldn't touch. But he couldn't spend a dime of it. He was the poorest man on earth because he was utterly, completely alone. He would die in that cage, with only his hatred to keep him warm. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool evening air. I remembered the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., words that had carried me through the darkest nights of this deployment. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. I had hated my father for so long. It had been the fuel that kept me moving. But as I watched Mark and Mom laughing in the kitchen through the screen door, I realized the hate was gone. It had simply evaporated, leaving room for something better. I touched my stomach, where a new heart was just starting to beat. True honor isn't found in a medal pinned to your chest. It isn't found in the rank on your collar or the fear you inspire in your enemies. True honor is simply the act of protecting the things you love. I smiled, stood up, and walked inside to join my family. The war was over. And for the first time in my life, I was truly home. If there is one thing I want you to take away from my journey, it is this. Family is not defined by whose blood runs in your veins, but by who would bleed to protect you. Too many of us stay in toxic, abusive situations because we feel a misplaced sense of duty or fear. But remember, loyalty to an abuser is not honor. It is a prison. You have the power to break that lock. Whether you are fighting for yourself or for someone you love, courage is a choice you make every single day. Do not let fear dictate your future. You are stronger than you think. Thank you for riding shotgun with me on this mission. If my fight for justice touched your heart or fired you up, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us share more stories of survival and truth. I want to hear from you in the comments. What does true honor mean to you? Let's get a conversation started. And finally, from Mark, Mom, and me, Happy New Year. May 2026 bring you peace, safety, and the courage to stand up for what is right. Stay safe out there and I will see you in the next story.